When my husband called me just a housewife at a gala with 200 witnesses, I smiled and got champagne because I already controlled $8 million he didn't know existed. The Grand Metropolitan Ballroom in Manhattan glittered with crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across marble floors. I could smell expensive perfume mixing with aged whiskey and the metallic scent of ambition that clung to every executive in that room. My hand trembled slightly around the stem of my champagne flute, but I kept my face perfectly composed, the mask I'd worn for 16 years fitting like a second skin. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, stay with me. This story might change everything you thought you knew about power. Richard stood beside me in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, the one I'd picked up from the tailor that morning while he slept off another late night at the office. We were circulating through clusters of his colleagues, senior partners at Ashford and Sterling Investment Group, their wives decorated like ornaments designed to complement rather than compete. Someone asked about my background. I felt Richard stiffen before he even opened his mouth, that telltale tension in his shoulders that meant he was about to perform. He said I was just a housewife, emphasizing the just with a condescending smile that pulled rehearsed laughter from the circle around us. Someone needed to handle domestic things while he built the empire, right? The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that would eventually become tsunamis. 16 years of marriage evaporated in that moment. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone, that particular mixture of contempt and amusement, as if my existence was an inside joke everyone shared at my expense. I smiled politely, murmured something about needing more champagne, and walked away with whatever dignity I had left. My heels clicked against the floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Something inside me cracked in a way that could never be repaired. I could feel it physically, like ice fracturing under pressure, spreading through my chest in cold, branching lines. What Richard didn't know, what nobody in that glittering ballroom knew, was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 8 years without even realizing it. The diminishing started so gradually, I almost didn't notice it happening. In the beginning, Richard was different, or maybe I was just better at ignoring the signs. We met at a corporate mixer in Boston 12 years ago, when I was working as a financial analyst at Morrison Consulting. He seemed impressed by my work, asked intelligent questions about market projections and risk assessment models. He told me I was brilliant. He told me I was going to change the world. 6 months into our marriage, those compliments transformed into something else entirely. He started saying I didn't understand because it was corporate world stuff when I asked about his day. The implication was clear. My world was smaller, less significant, not worth his time to explain. The interruptions came next. At dinner parties with his colleagues, I would start speaking, and Richard would talk over me as if I hadn't made a sound. The first time it happened, I thought it was accidental. The 5th time, I realized it was a pattern. The 20th time, I understood it was a strategy. He was systematically erasing me from conversations, making me disappear in plain sight while everyone watched and said nothing. At the firm's Christmas party last year, I mentioned my previous work in financial consulting. Richard laughed and said that was so long ago it barely counted, dear. His secretary Victoria witnessed that moment with a satisfied smile that haunted me for months afterward. I felt my face flush hot with humiliation, then immediately go cold as I forced myself to laugh along, as if he'd made a charming joke, instead of publicly diminishing 6 years of my professional life. What none of them knew was that I never really left my world. While Richard assumed I spent my days organizing dinner parties and supervising home renovations, I was quietly managing the investments from my inheritance. My father was a brilliant financial analyst who taught me everything he knew before lung cancer took him a decade ago. He left me $2,500,000. Richard suggested he should handle it for me, using that gentle voice men use when they think women can't grasp complex concepts. I smiled, nodded, and opened separate accounts he never discovered. I transformed that money into $8,200,000 through strategic investments in technology startups and commercial real estate. I did it all using my maiden name, Thornton, keeping this financial empire completely invisible to Richard Caldwell. The microaggressions accumulated like sediment, building layers of resentment I didn't fully acknowledge until much later. There was the time Richard's colleague asked if I worked, and Richard answered for me before I could speak, saying I was too busy managing our household to work outside the home. The dismissive way he said household made it sound like I was organizing sock drawers rather than running a complex domestic operation. There was the morning I tried to discuss a news article about market volatility, and Richard patted my hand and told me not to worry my pretty head about things like that. My stomach twisted with anger I swallowed down like bitter medicine. There was the dinner where I mentioned a book I'd read on emerging markets, and Richard literally rolled his eyes and changed the subject as if I'd said something embarrassingly stupid. Each incident sent a physical shock through my system, a jolt of adrenaline followed by a wave of exhaustion. But I was competent in ways Richard never saw. Every morning, I woke at 5:30 and checked Asian market openings, analyzed currency fluctuations, read reports from 3 different financial news sources. By the time Richard woke at 7, I'd already made 2 investment decisions and sent instructions to my broker. I tracked 17 different holdings across 4 sectors, rebalancing my portfolio quarterly with precision that would have impressed my father. I specialized in identifying undervalued commercial properties in emerging neighborhoods, buying buildings in Portland and Denver before the development boom hit. I sold a property in Seattle for 378% profit after holding it for just 27 months. My returns averaged 23.4% annually, crushing the market average. But Richard thought I spent my mornings drinking coffee and reading lifestyle magazines. The pattern of disrespect was so consistent, I could have graphed it. Public humiliation at social events happened approximately every 6 weeks. Private dismissals of my opinions occurred daily. The assumption that I understood nothing about his world became the foundation of our entire relationship. He built his identity on the premise that I was decorative but intellectually negligible. What Richard didn't understand was that his contempt was creating something dangerous inside me. Not the hot rage that burns out quickly, but the cold fury that calculates and plans and waits for exactly the right moment. I could feel myself changing, the soft woman he thought he married, hardening into something else entirely, something he wouldn't recognize until it was far too late. I showed him the perfect wife externally, while internally I was taking notes. Every dismissive comment, every public humiliation, every moment he made me feel small, I cataloged and stored away. I didn't know yet what I would do with this inventory of grievances, but I knew with absolute certainty that eventually there would be a reckoning. I noticed things he thought I was too simple to see. Oh no, way Victoria looked at him when she thought no one was watching. The expensive restaurants charged to his corporate card in cities where the firm had no clients. The late nights that became overnight trips. The subtle shift in his cologne from the brand I bought him to something more expensive, more seductive. I noticed everything and said nothing, letting him believe I was exactly as oblivious as he thought I was. The night of the gala changed everything. I went home in silence while Richard drove, praising himself for the excellent impression he'd made on the investors. He talked for 37 minutes straight about how perfectly he'd handled questions about the firm's new international fund, never once asking if I was okay or even noticing my silence. When we got home, he kissed my forehead absently and went straight to his office to send follow-up emails. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, sat on the edge of our bed, and let the full weight of that moment in the ballroom crash over me. Just a housewife. The words echoed in my head like a diagnosis I'd been avoiding for years. The next morning, while Richard was at the office, I opened my laptop with hands that felt steadier than they had in months. I started connecting dots I'd been deliberately ignoring because facing them would mean facing the truth about my marriage, the strange hours he kept, the business trips to cities like Miami and Chicago, where Ashford and Sterling didn't have clients, the expensive perfume on his jacket collar, definitely not my scent, something younger and more aggressive. The phone calls he took in another room with the door closed. The way he smiled at his phone sometimes with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in years. It took me 3 days of careful, methodical investigation. I didn't confront him or make accusations. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen, someone I found through a divorce attorney I'd consulted purely for informational purposes 6 months earlier. Marcus was thorough and discreet, exactly what I needed. He delivered a dossier to me on a Tuesday afternoon while Richard was in a partners meeting. The manila folder felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the end of my marriage. Richard had an apartment in Tribeca. It was registered under an LLC called Sterling Properties Management, buried in paperwork designed to obscure ownership. Victoria Brennan, his 28-year-old secretary with her sharp suits and sharper ambitions, had keys. The photos were explicit and dated, a timeline of betrayal that stretched back 18 months. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast that morning, and looked at images of my husband with another woman in positions that made it clear this wasn't just an affair, but a relationship. They had routines, inside jokes, a whole life I knew nothing about. My hands didn't shake as I turned the pages. Instead, I felt a strange calm settling over me, cold and clarifying. But it was the final document in Marcus's dossier that transformed my hurt into something else entirely. Richard and Victoria weren't just having an affair. They were planning something much bigger. Marcus had found evidence of a massive asset transfer being prepared, funds moving from client accounts into offshore holdings. Richard was using his position as senior partner to embezzle money from the very people who trusted him with their retirement savings and investment portfolios. The scheme was sophisticated and had been running for at least 11 months. They were siphoning off small amounts from dozens of accounts, amounts carefully calculated to stay below the thresholds that would trigger automatic audits. The plan was elegant in its criminality. In approximately 6 months, Richard and Victoria would disappear with around $12 million, leaving behind not just a destroyed marriage, but dozens of ruined investors. Some of these people were elderly clients who'd trusted Richard with their entire life savings. My husband wasn't just unfaithful, he was a criminal waiting for the perfect moment to vanish. I read through the bank statements Marcus had somehow obtained, the shell company registrations, the email exchanges discussing timeline and logistics. Victoria wrote about buying a villa in Costa Rica. Richard responded with details about countries without extradition treaties. Something fundamental shifted inside me as I absorbed this information. The hurt from the affair felt almost quaint compared to the scope of what he was actually doing. This wasn't just about betraying me. This was about destroying lives without remorse. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, an 81-year-old widow who came to the firm's Christmas party every year and always told Richard how grateful she was for his careful management of her late husband's pension. I thought about the Matsuda family who'd trusted Richard with their son's college fund. All of them would lose everything while Richard and Victoria sipped drinks on a beach somewhere, laughing about how easy it had been. I made a decision in that moment. It wasn't emotional or impulsive. It was calculated and ice cold. I would not just leave him or divorce him or even expose the affair. I would systematically dismantle everything he'd built. I would make sure he faced consequences that matched the scale of what he'd done. Justice through the system, using the law as my weapon instead of tears or confrontation. I called Daniel Whitmore the next morning. Daniel was a senior partner at Crawford & Lee, a corporate law firm I knew from my consulting days. More importantly, he had deep connections at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We'd worked together on a fraud case years ago, and I'd always respected his methodical approach to taking down financial criminals. I explained everything to Daniel over coffee at a cafe far from anywhere Richard might be. The affair, the embezzlement, scheme, the offshore accounts, the timeline. I handed him copies of everything Marcus had gathered. Daniel listened without interrupting, making notes on a legal pad with the same careful attention to detail I remembered. When I finished, he looked at me with something like respect and told me I was sitting on a legal goldmine. He said he'd handle it, but I needed to be patient and strategic. Within 72 hours, the SEC opened a confidential investigation. I filed for divorce that same week, citing irreconcilable differences without mentioning infidelity or financial crimes. I wanted Richard to feel safe, to believe I was the passive wife he'd always assumed I was, right up until the moment everything collapsed around him. The divorce proceedings were deliberately bland. I played my part perfectly, the hurt wife who just wanted out of an unhappy marriage. Richard's attorney was a sharp woman named Diane Foster, who clearly thought I was making a mistake by not fighting for more. She didn't know I didn't need more. I had $8 million Richard knew nothing about. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted on 16 years ago now worked in my favor, allowing a clean break without extensive financial discovery. I asked for the house in Connecticut, which was worth far less than Richard assumed I thought it was, and a modest monthly payment. Richard's relief was visible. He thought he was getting away with something that I was too unsophisticated to understand, what I was entitled to. His attorney told him he was lucky I wasn't more aggressive. Victoria sent him a congratulatory text that night saying they'd dodged a bullet. Marcus showed me the message. I'd asked him to keep monitoring both of them. Meanwhile, the SEC investigation was moving like a glacier, slow and unstoppable. Daniel explained that building an airtight case took time, especially with someone as careful as Richard. They were tracing money through multiple shell corporations, gathering evidence from banks in 3 different countries, documenting every fraudulent transaction. I met with Daniel weekly at different locations, always careful never to establish a pattern. He told me the investigators were impressed by the preliminary evidence I'd provided. One agent said it was the most organized initial complaint he'd seen in 12 years. I felt a flicker of satisfaction knowing my old skills were still sharp, but maintaining the facade was harder than I'd anticipated. I still saw Richard regularly because the divorce wasn't finalized. We were civil, sometimes even friendly, and those moments filled me with a complicated mix of guilt and rage I couldn't quite process. Part of me remembered the man I'd fallen in love with, or maybe just remembered who I thought he was, before I really saw him clearly. When he asked how I was doing, sounding genuinely concerned, I had to remind myself about the photos in Marcus's dossier, about Mrs. Henderson's retirement fund, disappearing into offshore accounts, about Victoria's text messages planning their escape. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful sometimes, like my brain splitting into two people who couldn't reconcile their different versions of reality. There were moments I almost abandoned the whole thing. One afternoon, Richard stopped by the house to pick up some documents and found me crying in the kitchen. Not about him, actually, but about my father, whose birthday it would have been. Richard held me while I sobbed, rubbing my back the way he used to years ago, and for just a moment I felt like maybe I was wrong about everything. Maybe the evidence was fabricated. Maybe there was an explanation. But then his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, asking what time he'd be at their place, and the spell broke instantly. He excused himself to take a call, walking into the next room, and I heard him tell her he'd be there in an hour. The tenderness evaporated like water on hot pavement. This was exactly why I couldn't back down. He was so good at performing care when it suited him, but it was always performance, never genuine. My sister Natalie became an unexpected complication. She called one evening, concerned because she'd heard from Richard's brother that I'd filed for divorce. Natalie thought I was making a huge mistake leaving such a successful man. She reminded me I was 42 years old and starting over wouldn't be easy. She said Richard might have his flaws, but he was a good provider. The conversation made me feel sick. Even my own sister had bought into Richard's version of reality where his financial success justified everything else. I wanted desperately to tell her the truth about the affair and the embezzlement and my hidden fortune. But Daniel had been clear about maintaining operational security. The fewer people who knew, the better. So I told Natalie I appreciated her concern, but this was my decision to make. She hung up disappointed, probably, thinking I was having some kind of midlife crisis. The loneliness of carrying this secret by myself felt crushing sometimes. Victoria became bolder as the divorce progressed. She attended firm events as Richard's +1, something that would have been inappropriate while he was still married, except everyone seemed willing to overlook it. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was telling people they'd been together for 2 years, rewriting history to make their relationship seem like it had started after my marriage ended rather than causing it. She wore a diamond necklace to the firm's spring gala that cost at least $15,000. I recognized it because I'd seen Richard researching it online from his laptop one morning. He'd been in the shower and left his computer open. At the time, I'd thought he was surprising me for our anniversary. The realization that it had been for her all along felt like swallowing broken glass. But I kept going to my lunches with other corporate wives. I maintained my book club attendance. I volunteered at the charity galas. I smiled and nodded when people expressed sympathy about my divorce, accepting their assumption that I was the wounded party limping away from a marriage I couldn't maintain. Every interaction required acting skills I didn't know I possessed. I was playing the longest game of my life, and the strain was starting to show in ways I couldn't always control. I lost 11 pounds in 6 weeks. I started waking, up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, mentally reviewing every step of the plan, checking for holes Richard might slip through. My doctor wanted to prescribe anxiety medication. I told her I was fine, just stressed about the divorce. She gave me a knowing look that suggested she'd heard that before from women in my situation. The timeline was the hardest part. Daniel said we needed to wait for Richard to make his move toward the offshore transfers, before the SEC could act with maximum impact. We needed evidence of the crime in progress, not just preparation. That meant watching him plan his escape for 3 more months while pretending I knew nothing. It meant sitting in mediation sessions discussing asset division while knowing all his assets would soon be frozen. It meant running into Victoria at the grocery store and making polite small talk while visualizing her arrest. The countdown clock in my head was relentless. 67 days until Richard's planned disappearance. According to the emails Marcus intercepted, 67 days to maintain perfect composure, while everything inside me screamed for resolution. I filled the waiting time by planning what came next. I researched commercial real estate in Manhattan, looking at office spaces where I could establish my own consulting firm. I started sketching out a business plan for advising women on financial independence and asset protection. I reconnected with former colleagues from my consulting days, casually, mentioning I might be returning to the industry. Everyone seemed surprised but supportive. One woman told me she'd always wondered why someone with my skills had stopped working. I didn't tell her I'd never actually stopped, just made my work invisible. The future I was building felt more real every day, something concrete to hold on to while I watched my past burn down in slow motion. The connections started revealing themselves in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus discovered that Victoria wasn't just Richard's secretary and mistress. She was the operational mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme. The emails Marcus intercepted showed her technical knowledge of offshore banking regulations, her detailed understanding of SEC audit triggers, her careful construction of the shell company infrastructure. Richard provided access and authority, but Victoria designed the system. She was far more dangerous than I'd initially given her credit for. This wasn't some young woman being manipulated by a powerful man. This was a calculated partnership between two criminals who'd found each other. I started noticing patterns in how they operated. Every third Thursday, Richard claimed he had late meetings with international clients due to time zone differences. Marcus confirmed these were actually nights he spent at the Tribeca apartment. Victoria scheduled these carefully around firm events and partner obligations, maintaining the appearance of professional boundaries while systematically looting client accounts. The precision was almost admirable if it wasn't so fundamentally evil. They had contingency plans for their contingency plans, backup documents stored in 3 different countries, emergency cash reserves, even fake identification documents Marcus found evidence of them purchasing. These weren't amateurs hoping to get lucky. These were professionals executing a well-researched crime. Daniel's SEC contacts revealed something that made the entire picture darker. Richard and Victoria weren't the only ones involved. A junior partner named Gregory Marsh was providing technical assistance, helping them access accounts he shouldn't have been able to touch. Gregory was drowning in gambling debts according to the background check Daniel ran. He needed money desperately, and Richard had offered him a way out in exchange for cooperation. The firm's entire security infrastructure had been compromised by 3 people working in concert. When everything collapsed, the damage would reach far beyond just Richard and Victoria. The whole firm would face scrutiny. Innocent partners would see their reputations questioned. Clients would lose faith in the entire organization. I thought about James Ashford, the founding partner who'd built the firm over 43 years. He was 71 now, planning to retire in 18 months. This scandal would destroy everything he'd worked his entire life to create. Part of me felt genuinely terrible about that collateral damage. But another part of me recognized that Ashford had enabled Richard's behavior for years. He'd laughed at the jokes about wives not understanding business. He'd promoted Richard despite complaints from female staff about his condescension. He'd created a culture where men like Richard thrived, and women like me were systematically diminished. Maybe some institutions needed to burn down before better ones could be built. The parallels between my situation and other women's started becoming impossible to ignore. At a charity luncheon, I sat next to Rebecca Chen, married to another senior executive at a competing firm. She mentioned casually that her husband never discussed work with her, because she wouldn't understand the complexities. I saw myself in her accepting smile, the way she'd learned to make his dismissal sound like consideration instead of contempt. At my book club, Amanda Torres talked about her husband managing all their finances because she wasn't good with numbers, even though Amanda had a degree in mathematics. These patterns were everywhere once I started looking. All these competent, intelligent women who'd been convinced they were less than they were by men who benefited from their diminishment. I started wondering what would happen if they all woke up the same way I had, if they all started building hidden empires and planning their own reckonings. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I wasn't special or unique. I was just the first in my circle to recognize the game being played and decide to flip the board, but I couldn't tell any of them what I knew. Operational security meant complete isolation. Daniel had been clear about that, so I smiled and nodded and made sympathetic noises while internally screaming at them to open their eyes and see what I saw. Marcus uncovered another layer that made everything more complicated. Richard's affair with Victoria wasn't his first. There had been at least 2 others during our marriage, both younger women who'd worked at the firm temporarily. One was an intern named Jessica who'd left abruptly 3 years ago. Another was a client services associate named Priya, who'd transferred to the Chicago office. Neither had reported anything formally, but Marcus found suspicious severance packages paid to both through the firm's discretionary fund. Richard had a pattern of pursuing women under his authority, using them, then buying their silence. The firm knew, or at least suspected, and had chosen to protect Richard rather than the women. The rot went deeper than I'd imagined. I realized Richard's dismissal of me wasn't just personal cruelty. It was strategic necessity. If I'd maintained my professional identity and independence, I would have been harder to control and easier to leave. By systematically erasing my competence and autonomy, he'd attempted to create a situation where I'd be dependent on him financially and socially. The affair and the embezzlement only worked if I stayed blind and passive. Everything he'd done to diminish me over 16 years had been building toward this moment where he would abandon me without consequences. Except he'd miscalculated catastrophically. He'd underestimated me so completely that he'd created the perfect conditions for his own destruction. The evidence against them was becoming overwhelming. The SEC had traced $11,700,000 moving through their network of shell companies. They'd documented 327 individual fraudulent transactions. They'd intercepted communications discussing the final transfer date, set for exactly 41 days from now. Daniel told me they had enough evidence to prosecute successfully, but they wanted to catch them in the act of the final transfer. They wanted Richard and Victoria and Gregory arrested while actively stealing money, making it impossible to claim misunderstanding or procedural error. The timing would be spectacular and devastating, but maintaining my ignorance was becoming almost impossible. Richard came to the house one evening to sign some divorce paperwork. He seemed almost nostalgic, talking about early memories of our relationship. He told me he'd always cared about me even if we'd grown apart. He said he hoped I'd find someone who appreciated me. The audacity of it. Sitting in my living room offering relationship advice while planning to disappear with stolen money in 6 weeks was breathtaking. I wanted to scream at him, to reveal everything I knew, to watch his face crumble as he realized how completely he'd been caught. But I just smiled sadly and told him I appreciated his kindness. He left believing I was exactly the foolish, gentle woman he'd always thought I was. Victoria made her own mistake during this time. She posted on social media about a luxury vacation she was planning, hashtagging it with countdown emojis. Marcus showed me the posts. Her excitement barely contained. She was already living the fantasy of her escape in her head, too confident to be careful. She posted photos of Costa Rican villas she was considering, beachfront properties with infinity pools and mountain views. In one photo caption, she wrote about new beginnings and fresh starts, about leaving behind everything that held her back. I screenshot every post, forwarding them to Daniel, who added them to the evidence file. She was building her own cage, one social media post at a time. The web was complete. Every thread connected to every other thread. The affair led to the embezzlement, which led to Gregory's involvement, which revealed the firm's complicity, which exposed Richard's pattern of abuse. All of it tied together in a comprehensive narrative of corruption and betrayal. Daniel told me the case was so strong that his SEC contacts were using it as a teaching example for their junior investigators. It showed how financial crimes rarely happened in isolation, how they emerged from cultures of entitlement and structures that protected certain people while exploiting others. My personal tragedy had become a case study in systemic failure. There was something darkly satisfying about that transformation. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing property listings in Manhattan. Daniel's voice was tight with controlled urgency. Richard and Victoria had moved up their timeline. They were planning to execute the final transfer in 11 days instead of the 41 we'd been expecting. Something had spooked them. Maybe an offhand comment from another partner, or a routine audit request that seemed too coincidental. Whatever the trigger, they were accelerating everything. The Costa Rica villa Victoria had been posting about was now under contract with a closing date set for 2 weeks out. Plane tickets were booked. The window for the SEC to act had suddenly collapsed from manageable to dangerously narrow. I felt my carefully constructed calm fracturing. 11 days wasn't enough time. The SEC needed to coordinate with multiple agencies, secure warrants, position agents appropriately. Daniel said they were scrambling, but it would be extremely tight. There was a real possibility Richard and Victoria might slip through our fingers, might actually make it out of the country before the arrests could happen. The thought of them succeeding, of them sipping drinks on a beach while Mrs. Henderson discovered her. Life savings were gone, made me physically sick. I spent that entire afternoon in my bathroom, anxiety radiating through my chest like electricity, unable to catch my breath properly. That night, Richard called asking if he could stop by to pick up some files he'd left in the home office. His voice was strange, higher pitched than normal, stressed in a way I rarely heard from him. I agreed because refusing would have been suspicious. He arrived at 7:30, moving through the house with jerky, distracted energy. He went straight to his old office, pulling folders from filing cabinets with urgent efficiency. I watched from the doorway, noting his trembling hands, the sweat on his forehead despite the cool temperature. He was afraid. Something had definitely gone wrong with their plan, and he knew it, even if he didn't know the specifics. When he left, I noticed he'd forgotten to close one of the filing cabinet drawers. Inside was a folder marked "Personal" that I'd never looked through before. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were documents I hadn't known existed. A life insurance policy on me worth $2 million, taken out 3 years ago. Richard was the sole beneficiary. There were also printed emails between him and Victoria, discussing my habits, my routines, my weekly schedule. They'd been tracking my movements with disturbing precision. One email from Victoria suggested I should have an accident before they left the country, something about a car crash, being cleaner than a disappearance. Richard had responded that it was too risky, but kept the option open as a contingency plan. I stood in that office holding proof that my husband had considered murdering me, not in a moment of passion, but as a calculated business decision. The life insurance would have funded their escape even more comfortably. My death would have been filed away as a tragedy, maybe blamed on stress from the divorce, while they started their new life in Costa Rica. The folder slipped from my hands and scattered papers across the floor. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in. Everything I thought I understood about the situation recalibrated in an instant. This wasn't just theft and betrayal. This was something far darker. I called Daniel immediately, despite the late hour. My voice shook as I described what I'd found. He was silent for a long moment before telling me to photograph everything and get out of the house immediately. He said I should stay with friends or check into a hotel under a different name until the arrests happened. The investigation had just become something much more serious than financial fraud. Conspiracy to commit murder changed everything. The FBI would need to be involved now, not just the SEC. Daniel's voice carried an edge of real concern I hadn't heard before. He told me Richard was more dangerous than we'd realized, and I needed to take my safety seriously. I packed a bag with shaking hands and drove to a hotel near the airport, checking in under my maiden name. The room was generic and anonymous, the kind of space designed to be forgotten. I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to being a problem Richard solved permanently, how easily I could have died in a staged accident while everyone mourned the tragic loss. Victoria would have probably attended my funeral, playing the supportive colleague, while wearing the jewelry Richard bought, her with money he'd stolen. The thought made rage burn through my fear like acid. The next morning, Daniel called with an update. The FBI had issued an emergency warrant based on the murder conspiracy evidence. They were moving up the entire operation. Richard and Victoria would be arrested within 48 hours, before they could execute either their financial escape or any potential violence. Gregory Marsh was already in custody, picked up that morning after the FBI showed him evidence of the murder conspiracy. Apparently, Gregory hadn't known about that particular plan, and his cooperation became immediate and total once he understood the full scope of what Richard and Victoria had been considering. He was giving them everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. I spent those 48 hours in a strange state of suspended animation. I couldn't eat. Sleep came in brief, nightmare-filled bursts. I kept checking my phone obsessively for updates from Daniel or Marcus. The hotel room became a cage. I paced endlessly, counting down the hours until everything would finally be over. My body felt like it was vibrating with tension that had nowhere to go. I did breathing exercises my therapist had taught me years ago. I took scalding hot showers trying to wash away the crawling sensation on my skin. I watched mindless television without processing a single word. Time moved both impossibly slow and terrifyingly fast. On the second night, I allowed myself to cry for the first time through this entire ordeal. Not pretty, dignified tears, but ugly, gasping sobs that left me exhausted and hollow. I cried for the 16 years I'd lost. I cried for the woman I'd been who'd believed in happy endings and the goodness of people. I cried for Mrs. Henderson and the Matsuda family and everyone else Richard had hurt. I cried for the future I'd imagined that would never exist. And underneath all of it, I cried with relief that I would survive this, that I'd seen the danger before. It consumed me completely. The tears felt like a physical purging, like I was crying out the poison that had been accumulating in my system for years. When I finally stopped, I felt different, lighter somehow, despite the heaviness of everything I now knew. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, really looked for the first time in months. My face was older than I remembered. Lines around my eyes I hadn't noticed developing, but my eyes themselves were different, clearer, harder, the soft woman who'd smiled politely at that gala while being diminished was gone. Someone else looked back at me now, someone capable of things I hadn't known I had in me, someone who would survive and build something better from the wreckage. The transformation was complete. There was no going back to who I'd been before. I didn't want to go back. Daniel called at 6:47 in the morning on Thursday. The arrests would happen today. Richard and Victoria were both scheduled to be at the office for a partners meeting at 9. FBI agents were already positioned around the building. SEC investigators had frozen all the shell company accounts overnight, stopping any last-minute transfers. Everything was in place. Daniel asked if I wanted to be there to witness it. I said yes, without hesitation. Some moments you need to see with your own eyes to believe they're real. I drove into Manhattan with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The city was waking up. Around me, millions of people starting normal days with no idea that my entire world was about to irrevocably change. I parked 3 blocks from Ashford and Sterling's office tower and walked slowly, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. My heart hammered against my ribs with a rhythm that felt like countdown. 10 more minutes. 9. 8. I could see the building now, its glass and steel facade reflecting morning sunlight. It looked exactly the same as it had hundreds of times. Before, when I'd visited Richard at work, back when I still believed in the life we'd built together. Daniel met me at a cafe across the street where we could see the building entrance clearly. He'd secured a corner table with perfect sight lines. 2 FBI agents in civilian clothes sat nearby, coordinating on discreet radios. Daniel handed me coffee I didn't drink, my stomach too knotted to handle anything. We watched people streaming into the building for their workday. I recognized several. Faces from firm events. Margaret Chen from accounting, David Lopez, who ran the client services division. None of them knew what was about to happen. In approximately 7 minutes, their workplace would transform into a crime scene. At 8:53, Richard's black Mercedes pulled into the parking garage entrance. I watched the car disappear underground, knowing Victoria was probably already upstairs preparing the conference room for the partners' meeting. Richard always arrived fashionably, late to establish dominance. A power play he'd explained to me years ago as basic psychology. Today, his arrogance would walk him directly into federal custody. I found myself holding my breath, counting the seconds it would take for him to park, ride the elevator to the 42nd floor, walk through the glass doors into what he thought was just another day of his successful life. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text. He showed me the screen. Subjects in position, moving in 30 seconds. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a rushing sound like ocean waves. My palms were sweating despite the cafe's air conditioning. Through the window, I saw 3 black SUVs pull up to the building's entrance. Men and women in FBI windbreakers emerged, moving with practiced efficiency. This was really happening. After months of planning and waiting and enduring, the moment had finally arrived. I thought about the first time I'd met Richard at that corporate mixer in Boston. How charmed I'd been by his confidence and ambition. How I'd believed we were building something together, a partnership of equals. I thought about our wedding day, the promises we'd made that I'd taken seriously while he'd apparently considered them suggestions rather than vows. I thought about every small moment of dismissal and disrespect that had accumulated into this ending. The trajectory from that hopeful beginning to this devastating conclusion played through my mind like a film reel, showing me all the moments I'd missed the signs or chosen to look away. Daniel received another text. In custody. Just 2 words that meant everything. I watched through the cafe window as FBI agents emerged from the building with Richard between them. His hands were cuffed behind his back. His face was pale and shocked, mouth open like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. The man who'd stood in that ballroom calling me just a housewife was being perp-walked across a Manhattan sidewalk, while morning commuters stopped to stare and take photos with their phones. The reversal was so complete, it felt almost surreal. Victoria appeared moments later, also in handcuffs, her expensive suit wrinkled from however she'd tried to resist. Her face was streaked with mascara and tears. She was crying loudly, making a scene that drew even more attention. The woman, who'd smiled with satisfaction while Richard publicly humiliated me, was now screaming about mistakes and misunderstandings while federal agents loaded her into a vehicle. There was no dignity in her arrest, no composure, just panic and the sudden understanding that her carefully constructed plans had collapsed completely. I felt a savage satisfaction watching her realize she'd lost everything. Gregory Marsh was brought out separately, his cooperation evident in the gentler handling he received. He looked numb and defeated, shoulders hunched like a man who'd already accepted his fate. I felt less anger toward him than the others. He'd been stupid and desperate rather than malicious, though that didn't excuse his participation. He'd still helped steal from innocent people, still enabled Richard and Victoria's schemes, but at least he'd chosen cooperation once he understood the full scope of the crimes. At least he'd had enough conscience left to be horrified by the murder conspiracy. Inside the building, I could see chaos through the glass walls. Partners and employees crowded around windows, trying to understand what was happening. Phones were out everywhere, people filming and texting and calling. James Ashford appeared at one window, his elderly face stricken with confusion and horror. This was his life's work being destroyed by someone he'd trusted and promoted. I felt a complex mixture of sympathy and vindication. He'd enabled the culture that produced Richard, but he was also watching his legacy crumble in real time. Some part of me that wasn't entirely consumed by my own situation felt genuinely sad for him. The media arrived within minutes. News vans pulled up with satellite dishes extending like mechanical flowers. Reporters positioned themselves for live shots with the building in the background. This would be the lead story on every financial news network within the hour. Ashford and Sterling's stock price would crater. Clients would flee. The firm might not survive the scandal. Innocent people would lose their jobs and reputations, all because 3 people had been greedy and cruel and arrogant enough to think they wouldn't be caught. The scope of the destruction was immense and would ripple outward for years. Daniel squeezed my shoulder gently. He told me I could go now if I wanted, that the rest was just processing and procedure. But I stayed in that cafe for another hour, watching the scene unfold. FBI agents carried boxes of evidence out of the building. SEC investigators arrived to begin the formal audit of the firm's accounts. Partners were being interviewed one by one. I saw Margaret Chen emerge looking shell-shocked. David Lopez was crying. These were good people who'd worked hard and done nothing wrong except trust the wrong person. They were collateral damage in Richard's war against integrity and decency. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. He'd been monitoring Richard's communications and wanted me to know that Victoria had tried to call Richard 17 times from holding before her phone was confiscated. She'd also sent him 3 text messages, one professing love, one begging him to fix this, and one blaming him for everything going wrong. Even in crisis, their partnership was fragmenting, revealing itself as the transactional arrangement it had always been. There was no loyalty there, no genuine connection, just 2 criminals turning on each other the moment consequences arrived. I finished my cold coffee and stood to leave. The scene would continue for hours, but I'd seen what I needed to see. Richard in handcuffs, Victoria crying, the firm in chaos, justice beginning its slow but inexorable process. As I walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't felt in 16 years, free. The weight I'd been carrying for so long was finally lifted. The fear and doubt and self-questioning were gone, burned away by the clarity of this moment. I'd been right about everything, and now everyone would know it. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks later in federal court in Lower Manhattan. I sat in the gallery wearing a navy suit I'd bought specifically for this occasion, armor disguised as professional attire. The courtroom was packed with journalists, affected clients, and curious legal observers. Richard and Victoria sat at separate defense tables with their attorneys, neither looking at each other. The partnership that had seemed so unbreakable had shattered completely under pressure. Victoria's lawyer was already negotiating a plea deal that involved testifying against Richard. The loyalty that had sustained an 18-month affair evaporated the moment prison time became real. The prosecutor was a sharp woman in her mid-40s named Sandra Mills, who'd built her career on financial fraud cases. She stood and began laying out the charges with clinical precision. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering through shell corporations, securities fraud, affecting 73 separate client accounts, attempted theft of $11,700,000. Each charge landed like a physical blow. I watched Richard's face grow paler with every word. His attorney, an expensive defender named Robert Kane, who charged $900 an hour, kept leaning over to whisper in his ear, probably trying to manage his client's visible panic. But Sandra wasn't finished. She introduced evidence I'd provided through Daniel and Marcus's investigation. Bank statements showing the systematic theft, email communications between Richard and Victoria planning their escape, the life insurance policy taken out on me, the emails discussing my potential accident. That last revelation caused audible gasps throughout the courtroom. Journalists' fingers flew across keyboards. Several people turned to look at me, finally understanding my role in this. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I felt vindicated in ways I couldn't fully express. Sandra called her first witness. Marcus Chen took the stand and described the investigation he'd conducted at my request. He detailed following Richard and Victoria to the Tribeca apartment. He explained the forensic examination of their digital communications. He presented evidence of their planned departure, including the Costa Rica villa purchase and fake identification documents. His testimony was methodical and devastating, each fact building on the previous one to create an inescapable narrative of guilt. Richard's attorney tried to object repeatedly, but the judge overruled him every time. The evidence was too solid to challenge effectively. The second witness was Gregory Marsh. He'd taken a plea deal in exchange for complete cooperation, and he delivered exactly what the prosecution needed. He described in detail how Richard had approached him about the scheme, how Victoria had designed the technical infrastructure, how they'd carefully selected which accounts to target based on clients' ages and likelihood of noticing small discrepancies. He explained the shell company network and the offshore banking arrangements. He admitted his own participation and expressed remorse that sounded genuine, though perhaps calculated to help his sentencing. His testimony lasted 2 hours, and when it ended, Richard's defense looked hopeless, but the prosecution had saved the most damaging evidence for last. Sandra introduced recorded phone conversations between Richard and Victoria from the weeks before their planned escape. The FBI had gotten a wiretap warrant based on the evidence I'd provided, and they'd captured everything. The jury and gallery heard Victoria discussing how much she was looking forward to never seeing Richard's pathetic wife again. They heard Richard laughing about how I'd signed the divorce papers without even reading them carefully, how I was exactly as stupid as he'd always known I was. They heard both of them mocking Mrs. Henderson and other elderly clients they were stealing from. Then came the recording that made the entire courtroom go silent. Victoria asking about the Claire problem and whether Richard had made a final decision. Richard responding that an accident was still the cleanest solution, but the timeline was getting tight. Victoria suggesting they could stage something after they left the country, maybe hire someone to handle it remotely so they had an alibi. Richard agreeing that was smarter, more distance between them and any investigation. They discussed my life insurance policy like they were planning a vacation, casually weighing the benefits of murdering me against the risks of getting caught. I sat in that courtroom listening to my husband discuss killing me, and felt strangely detached, like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. The shock had worn off weeks ago when I'd first found the evidence. Now there was only cold clarity. This was who Richard actually was beneath the charm and success. A man, capable of murdering his wife for financial convenience. A man who'd spent 16 years systematically destroying my sense of self-worth to make me easier to control and eventually dispose of. The recordings removed any doubt, any lingering question about whether I'd overreacted or misunderstood. This was real and documented and undeniable. Richard's attorney requested a recess. He looked shaken, probably realizing his client had lied to him about the scope of the crimes. When court resumed, Kane made a half-hearted argument about the recordings being taken out of context, that his client had been joking or speaking hypothetically. Sandra demolished that defense in 3 sentences. pointing out that jokes don't involve researching life insurance policies and tracking someone's daily movements. The judge looked at Richard with unconcealed disgust. I could see Richard finally understanding that he wouldn't charm or negotiate his way out of this. The system he'd spent his career learning to manipulate was now crushing him. The bail hearing was brief. Sandra argued that Richard was a flight risk, given the evidence of planned international escape. She noted he had access to hidden funds and connections in countries without extradition treaties. She presented the murder conspiracy as evidence that he posed a danger to witnesses, specifically to me. Kane argued weakly that his client was a respected member of the community with deep roots in New York. The judge denied bail, without hesitation. Richard would await trial in federal detention. I watched marshals lead him away in chains and felt something like grief for the man I'd thought I married, the person who'd never actually existed, except in my imagination. Victoria's hearing was separate but similar. Her attorney had already negotiated her plea deal, but she still had to allocate to formally admit her crimes in open court. She stood in her orange jumpsuit, a far cry from the designer suits she'd worn while stealing from clients, and recited a prepared statement accepting responsibility. She admitted to designing the embezzlement scheme, to the affair with Richard, to discussing my murder as if it were a business decision. Her voice was flat and emotionless, reading words her lawyer had written. There was no real remorse there, just recognition that cooperation was her only path to a reduced sentence. She was allocated to 5 years in federal prison. Richard would face significantly more. After the hearing, Sandra found me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She thanked me for my cooperation and told me the case was one of the strongest she'd ever prosecuted. She said my meticulous documentation and strategic patience had made the difference between catching them after they'd fled versus before. She told me I'd saved dozens of people from financial ruin and quite possibly saved my own life. Her words should have felt triumphant, but instead I just felt tired, vindicated, but exhausted. I'd won, but the victory tasted like ashes mixed with relief. The media wanted statements, but I declined through Daniel. This wasn't about publicity for me. It was about justice and survival. The journalists would tell the story their own way regardless of what I said. I'd become a character in a narrative I no longer controlled, which felt both uncomfortable and strangely freeing. Let them make me into whatever symbol they needed. The cautionary tale, or the empowerment story, or the victim who fought back. The real me was something more complicated than any headline could capture. I walked out of that courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt different somehow. Cleaner. The nightmare was essentially over. Richard would spend years in prison. Victoria, too. Gregory Marsh would serve reduced time, but his career was destroyed. The firm would collapse or reinvent itself without them. Mrs. Henderson and the other clients would recover their stolen money through asset seizures and insurance. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but ultimately successfully. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was real, and I was free. Finally, completely, irrevocably free. 6 months after Richard's sentencing, I stood in my new office on the 37th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city I'd reclaimed as my own. The space was mine, paid for in cash from my investments, registered under Thornton Financial Advisory, my father's name, and mine, together again. I'd hired 3 associates, all women who'd left corporate environments that didn't value them properly. We specialized in financial independence strategies for women in complex situations. Our client list had grown to 47 individuals in just 5 months. Word traveled fast among women who needed what we offered: discretion, expertise, and understanding born from lived experience. Richard was serving 12 years in a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. I'd received exactly 1 letter from him, which I'd read once and then destroyed. He'd written about regret and how prison had given him time to reflect on his mistakes. He'd asked if I could ever forgive him. The audacity of that request, coming from a man who'd planned to murder me, was almost impressive. I didn't respond. Some questions don't deserve answers. His name came up occasionally in news articles about corporate fraud cases, used as an example of executive corruption. He'd become a cautionary tale, which felt like appropriate justice. Victoria was in a minimum security facility in West Virginia, serving her 5-year sentence. I'd heard through Marcus, who stayed in touch out of professional courtesy, that she'd become something of a model prisoner, teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates. Apparently without any sense of irony, she'd tried to reach out to me through her attorney 6 weeks ago, offering to participate in some kind of restorative justice program where she'd apologize formally. I declined through Daniel. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need anything from her at all. Her chapter in my story was closed and locked. Gregory Marsh served 18 months and was released with probation. I'd seen him once, accidentally, at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. He'd looked at me with such profound shame that I'd almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He was working as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit now, his high-flying finance career permanently destroyed. He'd lost his professional certifications and would never work in investment management again. His punishment felt proportional to his crime, significant, but not life-destroying. He'd been weak and stupid, rather than fundamentally evil. James Ashford had retired immediately after the scandal broke. The firm restructured under new leadership, rebranded as Sterling & Associates after buying out the Ashford name. They'd implemented new oversight protocols and compliance, systems designed to prevent future fraud. Half the partners had left to start competing firms. The clients who'd stayed demanded and received enhanced protections and fee reductions. The institution survived but transformed, which felt like the right outcome. Some structures needed to break before they could be rebuilt better. Mrs. Henderson visited my office on a Tuesday afternoon 3 months after I'd opened. She was 82 now and moving slower, but her mind was sharp as ever. She thanked me for what I'd done, though I hadn't done it for gratitude. She told me she'd recovered every penny Richard had stolen from her through the asset seizure process. She'd even made a small profit from the settlement the firm had paid to avoid civil litigation. She was investing with a new advisor now, but wanted me to know that watching me stand up to Richard had inspired her granddaughter to leave an abusive marriage. The ripples spread in unexpected directions. Sometimes justice creates more. Justice. I'd changed in ways both obvious and subtle. I was 43 years old and felt simultaneously younger and infinitely older than when this started. I'd lost weight during the crisis, but gained it back as healthy muscle from the boxing classes I'd started taking. There was something satisfying about hitting things, about channeling rage into controlled physical power. My hair had started showing silver threads that I chose not to hide. I'd earned every gray hair through surviving what should have destroyed me. My face looked different too, harder around the eyes but somehow more peaceful. The constant tension of maintaining pretense was gone. The divorce had been finalized while Richard was in prison. I'd kept the Connecticut house but sold it immediately, wanting no connection to that life. I'd bought a loft in Chelsea, open and modern and entirely mine. Every piece of furniture was chosen by me. Every piece of art reflected my taste. No compromises or negotiations. The space felt like a physical manifestation of my freedom. Friends visited and commented on how different I seemed. More present, more myself. They were right, but couldn't fully understand the transformation they were witnessing. My relationship with my sister Natalie had improved after she understood what really happened. She'd apologized for pressuring me to stay with Richard, for not seeing the signs of his cruelty. She'd started asking me for financial advice and had even opened her own investment account, taking control of money her husband had previously managed. I watched her growing into her own power and felt proud. The changes in me were creating changes in the women around me. That felt like legacy more valuable than any monetary success. I'd started speaking at women's organizations about financial independence and domestic abuse, not sharing my full story because some details remained too private, but offering frameworks that other women could use. The response was overwhelming. After every talk, women approached me with their own stories of financial control and systematic diminishment. I'd collected business cards from 17 attorneys, 14 financial advisors, and 9 private investigators who offered services to women in my situation. We were building a network, an underground railroad for women escaping financial abuse. The work felt meaningful in ways corporate consulting never had. The media attention had mostly faded, though occasionally. Journalists reached out requesting interviews. I'd done one long-form piece with a financial magazine about recognizing embezzlement warning signs. I'd declined all the offers from producers wanting to option my story for television movies. This wasn't entertainment. It was my life, messy and complicated and still being actively processed. Maybe someday I'd be ready to package it as narrative content, but not yet. The wounds were still too fresh even 6 months later. I'd started dating again, carefully, and without expectations. Nothing serious yet, but I was learning to trust my judgment about people's character. I'd gone to dinner with an architect named Michael, who was divorced and had genuine curiosity about my work. I'd had coffee with a professor named Sandra, who made me laugh and didn't ask invasive questions about my past. I wasn't ready for anything committed, but I was ready to believe that good people existed, that not everyone would betray trust so catastrophically. Hope was returning slowly, like feeling coming back to numb fingers. My investments continued performing well. The $8 million had grown to $9 million, $300,000 through careful management, and some fortunate timing in the commercial real estate market. I'd diversified more conservatively now, protecting what I'd built rather than chasing aggressive returns. Financial security meant freedom to make choices based on values rather than necessity. It meant never being trapped again. It meant being able to help other women escape their own traps. On quiet evenings in my loft, I sometimes reflected on the entire journey, from that moment in the ballroom when Richard called me just a housewife to standing in my own office with my name on the door. The path between those 2 points was jagged and painful, but ultimately transformative. I'd lost a marriage but gained myself. I'd lost illusions but gained clarity. I'd lost the future I'd imagined, but gained one infinitely better. The woman I'd become was stronger and wiser and more authentically herself than the woman I'd been before. I thought about all the women still living in the before, still accepting diminishment and disrespect, still believing they were less than they actually were. My heart ached for them because I remembered how that felt. The slow erosion of self-worth, the constant second-guessing, the performance of gratitude for crumbs of consideration. But I also knew that some people needed to hit their own breaking points before they could change. I couldn't save anyone who wasn't ready to save themselves. I could only build the infrastructure that would catch them when they jumped. The firm's tagline was, "You're never just anything." It appeared on our website, our business cards, our marketing materials. Every time I saw it, I remembered Richard's condescending smile, the way he'd emphasized that word just to maximize humiliation. I'd taken his weapon and transformed it into armor. Language was powerful. Words could destroy or heal, depending on who wielded them, and for what purpose. I chose healing now, though I'd learned destruction had its place too, when structures needed dismantling. If you're reading this story, if you're living some version of what I survived, please hear this. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. You are not too sensitive or too demanding or too anything. You are being systematically diminished by someone who benefits from your diminishment, and you have more power than you realize. Start building your exit strategy today. Open accounts they don't know about. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find your people. And when the moment comes, when you're ready to reclaim yourself, act with the precision of someone who knows exactly what they're worth. Richard taught me that being feared and alone was infinitely better than being loved and invisible. That loneliness chosen beats companionship that diminishes you. That starting over at 43 was better than staying in a life that was killing me slowly. He didn't mean to teach me these lessons, but I learned them anyway. The irony was thick enough to choke on, and I savored every bit of it. My first keynote speech was scheduled for next month at a women's finance conference in Chicago. The title was Invisible Assets: Building Financial Independence in Plain Sight. I'd be sharing strategies for protecting money within marriages, creating separate credit histories, investing discreetly. Information that could save lives, or at least save women from the trap I'd nearly died in. The organizers expected 300 attendees. I was preparing remarks that balanced practical advice with emotional truth, that walked the line between empowerment and caution. I stood at my office window watching the sun set over Manhattan, turning the buildings into silhouettes against orange and pink sky. The city looked beautiful and brutal simultaneously, exactly how I felt about life now. Beauty and brutality coexisting in the same space. My phone buzzed with a message from a potential new client who'd heard about me through a friend. Another woman ready to start building her escape. I responded immediately with available meeting times. This was the work now. This was the purpose. Helping women become invisible in the right ways, visible in others, and always, always free. If this story resonated with you, I hope you'll take something from it beyond entertainment. I hope you'll look at your own life with clearer eyes. I hope you'll question assumptions about what you deserve and what you'll accept. I hope you'll build your own escape routes before you need them. And I hope you'll remember that you're never just anything. You're everything you choose to become once you stop letting others define you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. Share with someone who needs to hear it. And most importantly, take action in your own life. The first step toward freedom is recognizing you're not free. The second is deciding to do something about it. I did, and you can too. Some questions don't have answers. Some wounds don't fully heal. Some losses can't be recovered. But some victories are so complete, they reshape everything that comes after. I won. Not in the way I'd imagined when I first said yes to Richard 12 years ago. Not in the way romantic comedies and fairy tales suggest, but in the way that mattered most. I survived him. I outsmarted him. I took everything he tried to use against me and turned it into the weapon that destroyed him. And then I built something beautiful from the ruins. That's the story. That's the truth. That's the ending and the beginning both at once.